Okay, welcome everyone. I hope you are very well. And as we open, if you would please take a deep breath with me, which is especially meaningful in this era of respiratory illnesses. And as we take another deep breath, please direct your thoughts, prayers, or intentions momentarily to those in this meeting and others around the world who are struggling and suffering. Thank you. So, welcome to this conversation on transforming a world in triple crisis: pandemic, climate, and the economy, about how to shift towards politics and culture that is squarely focused on environmental and economic justice, on well-being of people and planet. And I am so very happy that you chose to join us. I'm confident that you, the faithful, even when bombarded with a multitude of new and old concerns, can multitask to bring change. And the evidence is that you've joined this meeting tonight. I'm Lynn Lyle with Interfaith Creation Care of the Triangle, ICCT, the sponsor of this event, along with our other two sponsors, our sister network, Orange Chatham Interfaith Creation Care. We're going to meet Charles Coble from that network shortly. And also the other sponsor is Campaign NC, and Sue Woodling and others from that group are with us. So I can see Sue right there in that little square. Hi, Sue. So in our mission to care for creation, ICCT is guided by faith, informed by science, and focused on environmental justice. We have 275 members, many of whom are at our meeting tonight, and those members are associated with 65 communities of faith, including Buddhists, Catholics, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and others. And ICCT seeks ways to inspire and support one another to develop and enhance creation care in our own and other faith communities. So now a big thanks to the ICCT Communications Dream Team for getting us up to speed for our first large Zoom Facebook event. And that team includes Ralph Earl, Claire Cozen, and it's led by Tosif Assis. Tosif volunteers with the Zakat Community Center, and they are very busy now delivering groceries to those in many different communities who have needs, and he works full-time in communications too in his spare time. So Tosif will give us a flash review on some Zoom and Facebook tools for the meeting, because we have people on Zoom and people on Facebook. Tosif?
Thank you so much, Lynn. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. Just a few quick things. We are live streaming this on Facebook, and we are currently recording as well. So if you do not feel comfortable being recorded or being streamed onto Facebook, please do shut off your video at this time. So far, only Lynn has been shown in the video and in the live stream, but moving forward, if we do change the view inadvertently, someone else may pop up. So if you do not feel comfortable with that, please do shut off your video. And also moving forward, please do keep yourselves muted. We will only have the speakers and our panelists unmuted. If anyone does have any questions or any issues, we have sent out the communications team members' phone numbers. So please do feel free to text any of us with any questions. You can also chat us privately. You have that option if you go down to the bottom, a bar pops up and the chat option is there. I will send out a message to everyone, so you have my name. Please feel free to message me privately if you have any problems at all. We are streaming this live on Facebook, as we said, and we are currently recording. So this will be shared on the ICCT website and with our co-sponsors, so they can post it as they feel like they would like to. We will be having a Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, please do share them in the chat If anyone is unable to share from the chat here, we are also streaming on Facebook from the ICCT ICCT Facebook page. So you can comment on the live stream over there with your questions that we will have our panelists look at. Without any further ado, I will be giving it back to Lynn. And like I said, if there are any questions, please do message me privately. Thank you.
Thanks, Tosif. So a quick review of our agenda. After the opening reflection, Dirk Phillipson, our main speaker, will give us a brief talk, followed by three panelists, Rob Schofield, Kathy Coffman, and Elizabeth Gandolfo, who will respond to Dirk and join him in free-ranging discussion about possibilities for transformation. So then we'll have question and answer, and we'll end with a reflection during Ramadan. The opening reflection is from Elizabeth Gandolfo, who is also serving as one of our panelists on this program. She is Assistant Professor of Catholic and Latin American Studies at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And she received her PhD from Emory University. She's published 2 books and working on her 3rd. I was drawn to one of her lecture topics entitled Encountering God and Being Human, Where the Wild Things Are, Maternal Experiences as an Ecofeminist Source for Theological Anthropology. Wow, I got through that whole title. Didn't know if I could. So she was recommended to serve on this program by a former student who said she was one of her very favorite professors. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Lynn. This opening reflection consists of selections from a meditation published by Pope Francis on April 17th, the Friday after Easter in the Christian tradition. The meditation amounts to what he calls a plan for rising again in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and the accompanying triple crisis of public health, economics, and ecology. Pope Francis begins his meditation with the scene from the Gospel of Matthew, in which the risen Christ comes out to meet Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, and the first thing he says to them is, rejoice. What could this call to rejoice possibly mean in the midst of the pain and suffering that humanity is experiencing in this time of global pandemic? The Pope's words are illuminating and perhaps even inspiring as we seek to respond in life-giving ways to the health, economic, and ecological needs of this planet. I'll share with you just a few excerpts. Like these women disciples who went to the tomb, we live surrounded by an atmosphere of pain and uncertainty that makes us ask ourselves, who will roll away the stone? How will we overcome this situation that has overtaken us completely? Such is the weight of the stone in front of the tomb that imposes itself on the future and that threatens to bury all our hopes. This is the weight of the anguish experienced by vulnerable and elderly persons who traverse this quarantine in the most absolute loneliness. It is the weight of families who no longer know how they are going to put food on the table. It's the weight of healthcare workers and public servants who are feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. It's this weight that seems to have the last word. But Pope Francis insists that the weight of this pandemic and its accompanying crises will not have the last word if we come together in human solidarity with one another and with the earth. In his words again, if we have learned anything during this time, it is that no one is saved on their own. Borders are falling, walls are crumbling, and all fundamentalist discourses are dissolving before an almost imperceptible presence that shows the fragility of which we are made. In this time, we have realized the importance of uniting the human family in the search for a sustainable and integral development. Each individual action is not an isolated action for either good or for ill. It has consequences for others because everything is interconnected in our common home. If we act together as one people in the face of this and other epidemics that lie in wait, we can have a real impact. The globalization of indifference will continue to threaten us and tempt our path. But hopefully, we will find ourselves with the necessary antibodies of justice, charity, and solidarity. Let us not be afraid to live out the alternative civilization of love, which is a civilization of hope. This civilization of love is built every day without interruption. It requires the efforts of all of us. It requires, therefore, a committed community of sisters and brothers, siblings all. May it be so. Amen.
Thank you for those inspiring words, Elizabeth. So last year, 3 of us from ICCT heard Dirk Phillipson speak in Chapel Hill. I bought his book, and the name of the book is The Big Little Number. And I was led to think more broadly about how to approach creation care from his address and from his book. Dirk received his PhD at Duke University, where he is professor of economic history at the Sanford School of Public Policy and History. He's a longtime environmental activist, a Green New Deal advocate, and a founding member of the International Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Turning it over to you now, Dirk.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And Elizabeth, amen to those introductory words. Thanks also to all the folks at ICCT, the Orange Chatham Interfaith Creation Care and Campaign Nonviolence North Carolina for inviting me. And of course, welcome to everyone who is zoomed in from the many different places we are newly beginning to appreciate as home. Following Lynn's example, I would like to start by acknowledging with just a brief moment of quiet, the great amount of anxiety, confusion, of hardship, and of grief people are experiencing all over the world right now. Thank you. One of the more remarkable characteristics of this moment of time, and I think there are many, is its humbling quality. We can't help but learn how much of an illusion it was to have control. No one is really in charge. Knowledge is there and evolving, but above all, we begin to see how much we don't know, how little we can accurately predict. I won't even try to provide answers or solutions this evening, but I would like to use this moment to explore some promising shifts in thinking, to step out of old and possibly outdated assumptions about life, about human beings, about nature, and about what an economy is, and see whether there is some promising light on the other side. Above all, I will try to develop a line of thinking that sees our current predicament not just as the deep crisis it undoubtedly is, but also as a great and much needed opportunity for a fundamental transition. COVID-19 is not cause for the deeper wounds ripped open by the relentless spread of the parasite. Rather, it is symptom and manifestation. Moving from the fairly obvious and well-known, but nonetheless important, to the much less obvious and less debated, I will follow the spiritual leader Arundhati Roy when she recently wrote, and I quote, "The pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Unquote. So let me provide some examples for the carcasses and the dead ideas, and then quickly move to what I think would be a new life worth fighting for. We currently live in a world organized and for the most part organized by a pervasive ideology of gain, competition, self-interest. Most of us are constantly on the go, whether we like it or not, achieving, marketing, branding, selling, working, and lately, of course, for some of us, Zooming. Rarely do we ask, what is this actually good for? In the process, we participate in an economy that is linear, an economy that at bottom extracts, depletes, and exploits by producing for the dump. Indeed, our species, while increasingly crowding out all other living creatures, is the only one that produces mountains of trash that cannot be used by any other organism, but rather just foul up the place. I think the elephant in the room is a faulty assumption. And that faulty assumption is that economic growth translates into more prosperity. Robust research shows that while this was once partially true, it no longer is. Today, economic growth, as globally measured by GDP, causes more harm than good. Indeed, it is beginning to drive the collective human project off the cliff. Right now, of course, it is the chief reason why some politicians and academics callously argue that keeping the economy running is more important than protecting lives. Now, this is a complicated story about which we could talk for a very long time, but some features of this system are quite simple and can be delineated clearly. And here, I want to show you one of 4 slides that I have that I hope will work. So what you see here is the first attempt to look at developments in the world, both in the political world and in the ecological world, that exponentially increase when we have economic growth. And here is a more updated version of this that juxtaposes what this looks like when you look at socioeconomic trends, world population, GDP growth, energy use, and all those, and what it does to our Earth. And of course, what becomes very obvious in all of these graphs is that exponential growth is something that simply cannot go on forever. Now, there's one way to summarize the system that leads to such exponential curves. It's a system that cares almost exclusively about financial gain, about profit and growth. It's a system that has to grow forever. It's a system that produces enormous wealth, increasingly concentrated in the hands of very few, but also, and at the same time, enormous hardship and poverty. And it is a system that gives a few people in governments unprecedented amounts of power. Power to exclude, power to manipulate, and power to dominate. What does such a world look like? And I just want to share with you a few data points likely familiar to many of you. 4 people now in the world own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world combined, or as roughly 4 billion people combined. Our climate is on course to leave behind for our children a world we would likely not be able to recognize, but would certainly know how to fear. And let me specify how this happened. In just the 30 years since the first climate conference in Rio in 1992, which acknowledged the dire problem of climate change, we have emitted more greenhouse gas emissions than in all of human history before combined. Scarcity of resources, perhaps chief among them fresh water, is beginning to lead to ever more wars and conflict. The amount of roughly 1 week's global military expenditures equals the annual public school costs educating the world's young. And what little democracy there was in the world is now under sustained attack everywhere. So here's an exercise. What do we see when we look at something like, let's say, a mountain? The answer, according to our dominant operating logic, is minerals it contains, lumber it grows, and perhaps something like ski slopes we can turn into profitable ventures. If necessary to get to the minerals, let's blow off the top of the mountain or strip mine it. As entrepreneurs and politicians, in short, we mostly see it as a business opportunity, feeding the profit and growth machine. Nature becomes nothing more or less than a commodity. But what happens if we saw the mountain from the perspective of healthy earthlings instead? As human inhabitants who share this world with millions of other creatures and living organisms, all of whom we sorely depend on. If we engaged all of our senses, saw its beauty, its richness, its strength and its vulnerabilities, breathed in its fresh air, what would happen, in short, if we valued what matters and not just value that which can be sold in the marketplace? Now, you may say, of course, we already know the answer. People are more than economic utility calculators. All of us, on some level, enjoy nature, thrive in healthy communities, take solace in kindness and solidarity. COVID-19 merely brought to the surface what deep down we knew all along. That the good folks who grow the food, provide the healthcare, protect our streets, put out fires, are the ones who do the essential work for our well-being. Somehow, the highly paid corporate consultants and chief elbowing officers did not make the list. I want to... We understand deep down that if we continue to rape and pillage Mother Earth, we endanger our own lives. We know on some level that it is terrible to lock away millions of people in subhuman conditions. The US has more people in jail than any other nation on earth. Or that our institutionalization of old people often leads to desperate loneliness. We should also realize that there is no rationale, no morality of any kind that can justify why those who are privileged are allowed to close their borders to those in desperate need. In the end, one certain lesson of all huge disasters is that everything is connected, that my well-being depends on your well-being, that what comes out of my tailpipe helps cause droughts and wildfires and floods thousands of miles away, that my stake in the end is the end product of a huge value chain creation that burns down the rainforest in Brazil, depletes water and soil in Kansas, spreads methane across the globe. It's all connected. A system as unjust, as cruel, and as extractive as late-stage global capitalism is reminds me of Gandhi's answer. When asked what he thought about Western civilization, he famously replied, "I think it would be a good idea." My contention in the end is that both of the following are true. If you don't feel some existential dread right now, you are likely not paying attention. But, and this is what I want to transition to for the remainder of my short presentation, if you don't see the immense and historically unprecedented opportunities we have to build something better, something sustainable and more just, something that focuses on well-being of people and planet, you have likely also not paid attention. This is my claim. The rottenness of the current system is, at least for the most part, not a consequence of human nature, but a consequence of our currently dominating operating system. It is an operating system in which nature counts only as a so-called externality, and people matter only as producers and consumers. It is a system, as Robert Kennedy already pointed out in 1968, in which, quote, everything is counted except that which makes life worthwhile. Today we have what so many thought and spiritual leaders of the past could only dream of: knowledge and wealth to create the good life, and to do so in ways that are not just fair and kind, but also prosperous and full of promising opportunities. Despite rapid population growth, there is no doubt that we have everything we need to care for everyone: to educate and feed, provide healthcare and housing, give a job and basic income to every woman, man, and child. Right now, in the midst of a pandemic ravaging poor communities, we could guarantee everyone a job, provide everyone access to healthcare. We could begin to rebuild an infrastructure that focuses on essential services for all of us and construct it in a sustainable way. Renewable energy, farming in harmony, not conflict with nature, affordable and green housing, general healthcare, public transportation. Build back better. Quality, not quantity. A focus on outcomes, not output. My wife was just reading a book on the New Deal last week, on programs such as the WPA, or what you know as the Works Progress Administration. During a walk after, she asked me, almost like an afterthought, why is it you think that we always build all the very best things in our society? Schools, parks, amazing bridges, museums, only when we are in deep crisis and have no money? A good question indeed. We live in a world turned upside down, a world in which the economy is seen as more important than the society of which it is part, and the ecosystem upon which it so desperately depends. A world in which consumption is seen as more important than the vital needs of people and Mother Earth. Any smart 5-year-old quickly understands both folly and hubris behind such a logic. Yet I can't emphasize enough, it is precisely this logic what makes up the dominant line of thinking within global capitalism today. Having problems moving this thing, sorry. So here is a, you may have all seen the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN passed. And they usually are just shown in a rectangle, acting as if all the different SDGs, all the different goals are essentially of equal weight. And we redesigned this in order to show that, of course, what is actually happening is that the economy can only exist in a healthy and functioning society, and that a healthy functioning society can only exist in a healthy functioning biosphere. And so let's state the obvious, as it is nicely captured in this redrawn graph. Society can only function within a healthy ecosystem, and economy can only serve the purpose of human well-being inside a functioning society. Rather than us being slaves to an outdated economic logic, let's build an economy that actually serves humanity. An economy that measures what matters. An economy that puts a price on value instead of valuing only that which has a price. We can witness it at work right now, everywhere. Daily displays of kindness and support, from sharing produce to providing life-saving services. At times humorous and creative, at times simply courageous and amazing, it provides a glimpse of what could be. To put it differently, we could learn that lifelines are more important than bottom lines, that the good life is something altogether different from the goods life. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Phillipson. That was inspiring, a little scary, and very insightful. We thank you for the comments. I'm Charles Coble. I'm a professor emeritus in science education at East Carolina University and a member of the steering committee for the Orange Chatham Interfaith Creation Care, one of the co-sponsors of this organization. OCICC was formed back in only May 2019, a few months after the organization was established over in Raleigh. So we were following their lead, and we've managed to put together a lot of faith communities around a core idea. And that idea is to engage people of faith in congregations and other communities to become better stewards of the earth and address climate change and advocate for environmental justice for all life on earth, not just humans. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our three panelists who will provide some brief comments on Professor Phillipson's address and then dialogue amongst each other. And then we're going to open it up to everybody. So as was mentioned by Talsef earlier, everyone watching this event on Zoom, you're invited to use the chat feature at the very bottom of your screen to pose questions either individually or, to the entire group of panelists and the speaker, and let them respond. So your choice on how you do that. Also, we know that there are many people viewing this program that are streaming the Facebook site on the IC. How is it, Lynn? How do we say it?
ICCT.
Thank you, ICCT site. So, so you can propose questions either way. So our speaker and panelists will respond to your questions following their remarks and discussions in the order they present. So our panelists are, from a policy perspective, Rod Schoenfeld. Rod is director of North Carolina Policy Watch and a host of the weekly radio show News and Views. From the science perspective, Kathy Coffman will speak because she's a retired EPA air quality policy analyst, and she's now very active in local and state climate advisory boards and community organizations. And from the faith perspective, Dr. Elizabeth Gandolf, who you heard before, assistant professor of Catholic and Latin American Studies at Wake Forest University of Divinity. So let's begin with Mr. Schofield, okay? Please.
Well, thank you, Professor Coble. I am Rob Schofield. It's nice to meet you all. Nice to be with you all. Quite a task to follow those incredibly moving and profound remarks from Professor Phillipson. I'll try in a handful of minutes to give you some ideas about how the hell we go about doing this stuff, saving the planet, as it were, because it's pretty important work, and we need to get going on it. I hope you will check us out at NC Policy Watch. We were going to participate in the March event that unfortunately was canceled because of the weather. My colleague Lisa Sorg, who's the best environmental reporter in North Carolina, maybe in the country, was going to be on that panel. I hope you'll check her out on our website. She's got an important story coming on pesticides later this week. I suppose most of the people involved in this event are citizen activists, so this may seem self-evident to you as to how the heck we go about engaging in the policy debates that we need to engage in to make some of these kinds of changes, these urgent changes happen. But here are a couple of thoughts I think maybe we should keep in mind as we go about it. Number one is a famous saying, actually usually attributed to Winston Churchill. And I know Churchill had a lot of loathsome views, but he was right when he said something like, democracy is the worst possible form of government ever invented, except for all the others. And I think we need to bear this in mind at all times. Our mission really remains to make democratic government work for the purpose of attacking this global environmental crisis, this global moral economic crisis that confronts us. And to do that, we need to participate relentlessly and use every tool that the system provides us. And this means voting. This means lobbying. This means organizing. This means fundraising. This means being omnipresent on social media. All of those and more are the kinds of things we're going to need to do. We're in the battle of our lives here, the battle for the future of our species, of our biosphere, of our planet. There could be no more important work. And sadly, a lot of the folks with whom we are in a battle of ideas with have been just as relentless in another direction. I think we need only think about how some of the crazy ideas that now dominate our political debate were not seen as mainstream ideas. They were seen as extreme right-wing ideas 30 or 40 years ago, but through the sheer repetition, the sheer persistence of the folks with whom we often are engaged in a debate, they have found their way into the mainstream, and they are considered more reasonable today than they would have been years ago. So that's something to keep in mind. We need to mimic that persistence and indeed outdo it and be relentless in our advocacy as we go forward. The other thing to remember, I think, is that we don't have to convince the folks, those troubled souls who are out there in the reopen movement, the folks who are the dedicated supporters of Donald Trump. We don't need to convince them. We might convince their kids at some point. We need to win. We need to get 50% plus one. And that means we have to bring, in addition to a high degree of relentlessness to our participation in this debate, we need to bring a high level of pragmatism to it as well. I'm old enough to remember that it was Lyndon Johnson who actually got the Civil Rights Act passed in the United States. A troubled, bizarre, all over the map political character like Lyndon Johnson was the one who actually got it done. And while I understand and sympathize with those who long for truly righteous souls like, to come and lead us, and it was wonderful when we had the Barack Obama meteor shoot across our sky. Those kinds of characters, those kinds of individuals don't come along often. Most of the time, politics is not like a marriage. We're not going to find the perfect partner. It's more like waiting for public transportation, waiting for a bus. You're looking for the means of transportation that's going to take you as close as possible to the point you need to get to. So again, I think those are some of the things we need to bear in mind as we go forward. For a long time, folks with progressive points of view on issues like this have been getting outshouted. They've been defeated by other folks who have been more persistent. We need to match and exceed that persistence. We need to bring a relentless pragmatism to the debate over the years to come as we participate in this debate over the future of our planet. So that's my little 2 cents on how we go about entering and battling these policy wars. I look forward to discussing them more with you as we go forward.
Okay, Rob, thank you very much. That's very invigorating. And I want to remind everybody watching this that in a few minutes, you're going to be able to participate as well. That starts by your looking at your chat button at the bottom of the screen and trying to pose your questions, or if you're live streaming, using your comment section on live stream in the Facebook site with ICCT to post your questions. So if you would start posing those questions, and we'll have a panelist and a speaker ready to respond to them when the time comes. So let's move on from Dr. Schofield. Thank you very much, Rob. Let's go now to Kathy Coffman, please. Kathy, you're on.
Hi all. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I want to give you guys a little bit of additional hope and maybe a little energy. And I want to point out just a couple of things for a couple of minutes. And the first is that the COVID-19, the economic crisis brought on by COVID-19 and the climate crisis have basically the same solutions, right? Solving the economic crisis and getting rid of fossil fuels means putting people back to work, transforming society into the kind of society that we really want to see. It means putting people back to work in the jobs of the 21st century. You know, the climate crisis was caused by emissions of fossil fuels into the air, right? Gas, oil, coal, all of those energy sources of the 20th century. We need to move pretty rapidly to the energy sources of the 21st century, which means we need to make everything more efficient. We need to we need solar, we need wind, we need a transformation of society where that works for everyone. And in the economic crisis coming out of COVID-19, we also need a transformation of society in a way that works for everyone, that puts people back to work with a living wage, doing the kinds of jobs that need doing. And what needs doing to solve both that and the climate crisis? We need to weatherize home. We need a new citizens conservation, CCC is Citizen Conservation Corps, like the old New Deal and Works Project Administration. Let's spend some federal money putting people back to work, building out our infrastructure in a clean way. You know, bringing renewable energy, weatherizing homes all over the homes and buildings all over the country. You know, helping people out with their energy bills, making buildings more efficient, using less energy, and putting up wind farms and solar panels everywhere we want to see them, by giving people good blue-collar jobs doing that. Those are the kinds of things we need to do. And I know it seems like a big task. So I have given I give a talk sometimes on the Green New Deal. I've done it a few times. And one of the things that I really like to point out to people is that we've done this before. And this is how I'll end. When the New Deal, when the Great Depression started, Herbert Hoover was president, right? Roosevelt was not there yet. But when Roosevelt came into office promising people to help them out, you know, a chicken in every pot, and help transform society, he said a lot of things. And then when he got it, and he got people on his side, and when he finally did come into office, they did some amazing stuff. In the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, they passed 12 pieces of major legislation transforming society. And they didn't stop there. Over a 5 to 6 year period, they reworked the financial system, our economic systems, put people back to work, building all the wonderful structures we see today. They built the Appalachian Trail. They built infrastructure all over the country. They built dams. They built all kinds of stuff that people loved Roosevelt for, because he put them back to work, and because we got a lot of public goods out of that. We can do that again. We have the ability to do that again. Things look dark right now, but out of the darkness comes light, and out of this triple crisis is going to come, I hope and I believe, the ability of the American people to get together and focus on what we really need to do. We all know now that we need healthcare, universal healthcare, because having it through your job is not really working right now. We all know now that we need to put people back to work in good paying jobs. We can do that, making those jobs the jobs of the 21st century, the jobs that will bring us into a cleaner future. We have the money to do that. We have, our economic system can handle it. It's handled it before. Don't let anybody tell you that it can't handle it now. So I think I'll end there. I'm not going to run through a litany of all of the different parts of society that need to change to get rid of fossil fuels, but our transportation systems, our energy systems, our agricultural systems, we can make these changes. There's a whole lot of proposals out there with a lot of really good policies to do that. And we can do that while we're putting people back to work, and while we're making everybody's lives better and valuing what really matters. And I'll end on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I think you made a pretty good list there. That was
all right.
Great. All right. Those are terrific. That's a great follow-up to what Rob was saying about being pragmatic. Let's get some jobs done, and here are some things you can do. So, Elizabeth, let's go on to you to offer up your perspective from the faith community about this whole conversation we're having tonight. Thank you. You're on.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for this opportunity. From the faith perspective, I will speak most particularly from the Christian faith perspective, and even more specifically grounded in the Catholic tradition. And the first thing that I want to highlight from a faith perspective is that those of us who come from the Western Christian tradition, in order to fully immerse ourselves in this movement that y'all are talking about for the transformation of society, we need to, I think, constantly have in the back of our minds and in our daily lives, moments of confession and self-critique with regards to how the Western Christian tradition has been complicit in, and even overtly responsible for the rise of these economic models that Professor Phillipson has deconstructed for us. The Western Christian tradition has been complicit in and even overtly responsible for economic models that have historically depended on colonization and enslavement of people of color and plunder of the natural world. And the Western Christian tradition has also been complicit in and even overtly responsible for systems, economic systems and models that continue to exploit human beings today and the environment for the sake of profit and growth for its own sake. How is this so? Many reasons. We could go into an entire discussion of how the Christian tradition, particularly in the West, has justified these things and has really placed human beings at the center and at the pinnacle of creation, and has justified things like the prosperity gospel, which points to the accumulation of wealth and economic growth as blessings from God. But I will leave it there and just say, perhaps from this particular faith perspective from which I'm coming from, there's this need for a moment of confession and self-critique, so that we're constantly self-aware of where we might be falling prey to these tendencies, even in the current moment. And yet, Christianity is not a monolith. The Christian faith tradition is not irredeemable either. And so I think this tradition offers some really rich and beautiful resources for seeking a way forward in the midst of this triple crisis, this pandemic, the economic crisis, and the climate crisis. In particular, I'll draw in just a few comments. I'll draw on the major points of Catholic social teaching as major points where this tradition has something to offer. These points are not exclusive to the Catholic tradition, and they are held in common with many other Christian and other religious traditions, as well as humanist traditions. But the language that I will use is suffused in the Catholic tradition and its social teaching. The first thing that I think is a really profound and rich resource for a vision for moving forward and helping us to measure what really matters as we're thinking about how to construct a new system, a new economy, and transform the world for the sake of well-being and ecological flourishing. The first thing is the sacred worth and dignity of every person, every human person, and the non-human world as well. In Catholic social thought, every human being is made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and is of infinite worth and deserving of infinite respect and care. All of creation is also suffused with the divine presence in this tradition. God is in all things, as the Jesuits like to put it, and Pope Francis certainly stresses this within Laudato Si, and something that he brings to the table in Catholic social thought is a move away from anthropocentrism, a move away from placing human beings at the center and the pinnacle of all of creation, and a stress on how everything is interconnected. The second thing that I'll stress from the Catholic social tradition that I think can be a resource here is the option for the poor and vulnerable. This idea and the practice of the basic moral test of our responses to these crises, public health, economic models, the response to climate chaos. The basic moral test here, the guidepost, is how are the most vulnerable members of society faring? How does a given policy or plan affect those who are impoverished, sick, elderly, threatened in any way? And at best, in order to figure this out, we listen to the voices of those who are most vulnerable and most effective. They know what they need. Another aspect of Catholic social thought that can help us out here is the dignity of work and the rights of workers. This pandemic has brought into stark relief, as Professor Phillipson and some of the other panelists have mentioned, this pandemic has brought into stark relief how essential our essential workers really are and how unjust it is to continue treating them as though they were disposable. Finally, to echo some of the words from the opening reflection, which drew on the work, the meditation of Pope Francis, solidarity is central to Catholic social thought. And it is only in solidarity with one another. We are social creatures, and this only through solidarity will we move forward and transform these systems. It's only standing together in common cause for the sake of our health, well-being, and ecological flourishing on this planet that we can make a difference here. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Let's, I'm going to remind everybody watching it on Zoom or on the live stream on the Facebook that we're beginning to collect some questions that we're going to be asking in a few minutes. We encourage you to either make your comments or questions to particular people and post them, and we'll begin that. But first, we're going to have a discussion among the panelists, with Philip and with Dirk, and talk about what you all heard from each other. So, Dirk, I'm going to put that to you first. You just heard the response to your comments. What comments do you have on the comments, if you will?
Well, all the power to all three of them. So, what I heard from Rob, and which is absolutely vital to the conversation, is that we need to have, it's a contest between organized people and organized money, and we need to organize people. And we need to participate in the political process in a way that gives us the ability to formulate policy and to make changes. And we do still live in what, nominally speaking, is a democracy. And so this is our playground. The only thing that I would like to add to Rob is that we should not just simply confine ourselves in playing in that small, confined space, but that we also need to work on ways to expand that space. One of the things when I teach my history of capitalism class that students ordinarily have never thought about is that the big thing that is organizing much of our society, which is the economy, is not even nominally democratic. Never was in American history. Brilliant historians have written about the fact that even the Constitution was largely a capitalist constitution, not a democratic constitution, that the founders wanted to very deliberately limit the extent of democracy. So I think we also need to extend it. But other than that, I think Rob was right on target. Kathy, I think, is absolutely right. I love her spirit and enthusiasm, and she is a co-conspirator. And I am certainly in favor of all the steps that she would like to take and that we need to take in order not just to respond to this particular crisis, but in order to get our train onto a different track of a new sustainable economy and providing decent jobs for people and providing more security and more support in general. So that's awesome. And Elizabeth, of course, I just love what I heard. And I want to commend her for the, significant courage to point out that the Christian faith tradition, of course, has some, is complicit in some of those bad ideas that are currently governing us. But that it also contains many of the seeds that we can use in order to create a better society. And so I support all of it. Want to just add, one issue that I want to just freely admit gives me pause and great trouble these days, which is, one of my main research topics is economic growth. And I loved Obama like anybody, but whether you are looking at Democrats or Republicans, what they have fundamentally in common is that they're all pro-economic growth, that they really differ only in terms of how to best bring it about. I happen to think, after all the research that I have done, that ongoing exponential economic growth is a suicide pact. And so the problem in part is that we also need a politics that begins to seriously address not just some better, slightly better version of what we have, but also something very different from what we have. We need to, in other words, fundamentally change the direction of the train track.
Okay, thank you very much, Dirk. Let me just open it up to the panelists. Any reflections on what you heard from each other, or any afterthoughts about what you said? This is your time, and we have about 10 more minutes before we open it up to the participants, and the calls are coming in. So please make any additional comments that you would like to make as well. Okay.
Well, I certainly appreciated the optimism of all of our speakers. I think everybody believes that this is something that not only must be done, but that actually can be done. And I guess in response to what Dirk just said, I totally agree with him. And I want to reiterate the point that a lot of the ideas that are ascendant in our politics today, in our economic discussions, weren't always viewed as being so reasonable and mainstream. The ideas perhaps that we're espousing here tonight might not be perceived as being mainstream, and undoubtedly would not to the extent that they were shared in the broader discussion. But that doesn't mean we can't make them that way by repeating them, by saying them over and over, by giving voice to them, by holding forums like this, by relentlessly pursuing the debate in every corner of the country. So, I mean, I think it's ultimately a hopeful message I hear tonight. We just have a heck of a lot of work to do, and it's time to get after it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to agree with what Rob said. We can't be small-minded, or that's a wrong word. We can't be incrementalist about this, right? Society really does. This is one of those moments in history where society needs to be transformed, or we're going to reap the whirlwind. And I don't want to be negative after trying to be positive. The things that we want to do are the things that people actually want. Right. And if we pose it that way and we start talking about the big things that will make people's lives better, then we can transform society in a better way. Nobody drives by a coal plant or a natural gas plant and says, hey, isn't that awesome? But people do drive by solar panels, right, and say that. You know, people want good paying jobs. It's hard to argue against good paying jobs, except for all the politicians who argue against them. But you know, we have right on our side. The transformation that needs to happen is pretty clear if we repeat it over and over, as Rob said, and really drum in that those are the changes that will bring about, that will make people's lives better.
Yeah, good.
In response to Professor Phillipson's point about moving beyond the options that we have politically right now in terms of Democrats and Republicans all being pro-economic growth. I just wanted to point out my own research focuses on small grassroots movement that are living out those alternatives, even if they are not transforming the larger political landscape or offering up candidates that will win political power. There are so many grassroots movements across the country, across Latin America, where most of my study is done, and across the world, that are attempting to live out that alternative of degrowth and economies of solidarity as we speak. And so there's hope in that too, I think. And the possibility of looking for alternative ways to live our lives together at the grassroots level.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. If I just may pitch in real quick, again, I like everything I heard a great deal. And picking up on Kathy's point, I think this is a political organizing point too. She's absolutely right that what we want is indeed what most people want. And research shows this very clearly. And so part of our organizing task is indeed to find a new story, right, to couch it in different terms, because liberal and conservative is just not a particularly useful way to think about politics. anymore. And so, whether it is inequality, whether it is decent jobs, whether it is a sustainable future, whether it is the question as to whether we want our children and grandchildren to prosper as well. I mean, you can go down the whole line, and Kathy is absolutely right. This is something that usually gets in surveys the support of the vast majority of people, even in the United States. Right. And so Elizabeth is also, of course, right, absolutely, that when I travel, there's not a country you can go to where you don't find people in all sorts of nooks and crannies trying to, work with local currencies or organic farming or different ways of living or intergenerational living, and just so many beautiful projects and beautiful people doing amazing stuff. And oftentimes something that really just would need a little bit of networking and organizing and some coming together in order to be scaled up, which is in part what we're trying to do with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, to find a place where people can go and find out about each other. And so, Rob, yes, you're right. We need to, we keep battering at this and we need to keep fighting, but we also need to come up with new stories. We need to tell a different narrative because the old one doesn't work. And part of the promise of the Green New Deal was precisely that, was to begin to tell a new story. The little video that AOC did is really quite lovely and just sort of visualizing, allowing people to see what this different world might look like. That climate change is not just about tightening our belts, that we're not just talking about things getting worse, that we are actually talking about the promises of all these things that spiritual leaders and philosophical leaders and political economists of the past dreamed about, talked about, right? The fulfillment of a richer life that comes out of having created all this wealth, right? And instead, we're currently just plundering it and destroying things.
So we have a lot of questions. So I'm gonna actually cut our time short just a little bit to be able to bring in some of these fascinating questions we have from the audience to all of you. So if that's okay, if you'll let me have that license to do so, I want to. There are several. I'm going to try to cluster several of them, and it's around, Dirk, your concept, this idea of the gross national product, those three little numbers that have shaped this world and are shaping this world right now. Others are asking, we have Susan Ketchum over in Chapel Hill wanted to hear more about that. We have others, Jim Smith asking, can we talk about the GDP of gross happiness that's in Bhutan, if you will? And then Ria Kolmar, could you speak to the economic theory, the donut economics, put forward by Kate Raworth? These are people you know about. So this whole notion of, I guess what we need is a primer on where do we get started? First of all, we buy your book, and then we have another seminar. Dirk, let's start with you and let others open up and give their comments as well.
I think those are brilliant starts, absolutely. So I don't want to take up too much space and time here, but let me just see whether I can provide some basic thoughts about this. GDP is unique in many ways, but the primary way in which it is unique is that it is a universal. It's a global measure. There's not a single country outside of possibly Bhutan and Cuba and North Korea that do not use that measure in order to define economic success. That's the first one. The second one is that it is a profoundly stupid measure, that it literally only counts that which is output in the economy, and it makes no differentiation between good and bad, for instance, right? And of course, worst of all, it leaves out entire things altogether. It leaves out the work of most, nurturing and care work. It leaves out the services that nature provides, and so on. So it's a profoundly stupid measure that might have had a purpose and a function in a time of crisis and war, but it is completely anachronistic and completely outdated today. Nonetheless, it is still the primary indicator for success in every country in the world. And in fact, the way we think about success and the way we measure size and power of a country is oftentimes nothing other than a function of GDP. How big is their GDP? When the biggest nations meet somewhere, it's the G7. What are the G7? The G7 are the countries with the biggest GDP. Now, but even worse, GDP is ultimately actually a fairly good representation of the goals and purposes of capitalism. Capitalism has no morality. Capitalism is not about people. Capitalism is about growth and profit, right? And the market that we all swear by so much has undoubtedly many positive functions and is useful in many ways, but it becomes a fascist tool when everything that happens in a society is organized by the logic of the market, right? And so where we are currently is that the initially fairly good idea that we should leave some of those things to supply and demand as to how we organize society, rather than to kings or queens or prime ministers or dictators or whatever, is now turned into its own totalitarian version. And GDP is a fairly adequate measure of that. The problem is, of course, precisely two things. One, that it leaves out most of what makes life worthwhile. And two, that it puts us on a track towards exponential growth. Right? Some of my colleagues made fun about the fact that most people don't really understand the exponential function. And one of our biggest political problems is, in fact, that people don't understand the exponential function. But to just give you a sense of what that means is at a growth rate of 3%, that economists would consider to be a healthy, robust growth rate, the American economy would have to double in output every 26 years, right? Now, you give that kind of proposition to any smart 5-year-olds and they will shake their head and say, that's insane. There's just no way that that can happen, right? That type of exponential growth simply cannot happen on a finite planet. Now, there are unfortunately plenty of people who now say, okay, growth maybe is too crude. Let's call it green growth, or let's call it sustainable growth, or let's call it regenerative growth. But they just simply throw sand into our eyes and try to distract us from the fact that it is the growth that cannot happen. And here, and I didn't really want to do this, but I'm going to give it to you now. Here we run into the central dilemma. Capitalism requires growth because if it doesn't grow, we call this a crisis or a recession or a depression. So we need growth in order to have a healthy economy. We can't have growth because otherwise we're all going to die. Right? And so what that means is, at a minimum, and I don't really care about terminology at all, call it whatever you want to call it, but we do need a fundamental transition away from the growth imperative that is part of the DNA of capitalism. Call it reformed capitalism, call it like whatever, but it needs to happen, right? Because there is no way to sustainably grow exponentially forever.
Okay, I want to put a question to Elizabeth that's somewhat related to that, and that is the resistance in the church to even hear this message. And we're not going to have time for long answers, but we need your answer to that. This question came from the director of Social Justice Ministries at the Raleigh Cathedral Parish. And so this is a question that a member of your faith community is putting forward, that how do we deal with, even with the Pope and his wonderful messages that has inspired the world, there's resistance in the church to even hearing the message. And that, of course, this is just one faith community. We'll get the rest of them later, okay? So Elizabeth, you need to come off of your mute and give us your comments.
Oh, that is a question that I really don't have an answer for. I'm very humbled by it. I am heartened to see that there is a social justice ministry at the Raleigh Cathedral Parish. I grew up in the Roman Catholic Church post-Vatican II, and I went to Catholic school from K through 12, and I never even heard of Catholic social teaching until I reached college, till I reached the undergraduate level and went to a Jesuit university where we were required to take theology classes. And of course, for the Jesuits, Catholic social teaching is very much part and parcel of what it means to be Catholic. So the fact that it exists, that is a sign of some hope for me. But it is also quite disheartening to know that even with that ministry in place, and even with the leadership of Pope Francis in place, that Catholics are resistant to not only the social justice messages of Catholic social teaching, but to the ecological message as well. I think that this has a lot to do with particularly white Catholics rising in the ranks of our economic structures in this country and attaining a certain amount of prosperity in which we benefit from the privileges of being able to consume. I believe that Professor Phillips, in a video that I watched of you before in preparation for today, you said something about how we consume, or we spend money we don't have I can't remember the whole quote, but we are now, at least most white Catholics are at the point where we have entered the ranks of those who are primary consumers within this economic system. So we benefit from it. So of course there will be resistance to deconstructing that position of privilege. And I think it takes long and patient, difficult work to do that. I think that the millennial generation and the generation that comes after them, I guess is Generation Z now, may be more open to this. And so that may be where our hope lies. But I wish I could give you more than that.
Oh, look, and you know, every faith community would be in the same dilemmas you're in right now, so that's not an issue. So I'm reminded that we're at 7:58, and we're going to have to end this conversation very soon. But we have lots of other questions. People want to know, can we get the slides, Dirk, that you showed earlier? And so I assume, Lynn, that we'll find a way to post those. And Rob, people are giving you all kinds of advice about new articles you need to write for your magazine. But others are concerned about just the pure, also just the human population growth. And this link that Elizabeth just made, that everybody wants to prosper up. Nobody wants to not do well. It's a real dilemma in terms of how do we reimagine a future that isn't based on, Dirk, the measures you're talking about. But I think your message is loud and clear that we have to imagine that. One of our viewers, Herman Green, is a writer and thinker along the lines of the work of Thomas Berry, who actually wrote a book called The Dream of the Earth and started reimagining what life would be like on this earth if we looked at it a different way. And so I think our panelists have both presented and been challenged by some of the comments. Kathy, I think you drew out that long list a few minutes ago. I wonder if you wish to either retract your list now, throw up your hand, or add to your list before we close out.
Well, I just, if I could really.
Go ahead, Dirk. I'm sorry.
I didn't talk about donut economics and all those kinds of things earlier, and I apologize for that. But so some of the resources I actually send out, or you all send out some resources that people can look at that explain some of this stuff. Donut economics is one of many really, really promising ways of thinking about a future economy. And so one thought that I just wanted to throw out is that, yes, of course, it is true that there are still an enormous number of people who are in dire need of the basics, a job and a decent income and decent work and all of that. It is, however, not true that economic growth is necessary in order to provide that, right? I want to just restate something that I said earlier, which is that we have more than enough. And in fact, the question with GDP and growth is, we need to begin asking questions. What do we want to develop, and what do we want to grow, and how do we want to live? And not just simply follow an output indicator, right? Okay. So it's literally about quality rather than quantity, and taking care of people in a much more egalitarian kind of way.
So we're going to have to leave it at that. And thank you very much for your speech and for your speech and for your comments. And so I'm going to turn now to Taos of Aziz, who's going to provide a reflection from the Islamic faith, and then over to Lynn to close the meeting out. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the questions we had. And the meeting is being recorded and it will be shared. Thank you.
I'll pick up on that, Tosif, and introduce Dr. Illiff. Can you hear me? Okay. At the last minute, we are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Jasila Illiff with us to do a closing reflection during the season of Ramadan. Mm-hmm. And she balances her work as a physician with volunteering with the Zakat Foundation and being a mother of 2 daughters. So, Dr. Illiff, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see?
You're on.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak on this special day, and special occasion, really, and special time all over. I would like to give a quick overview about Ramadan, which started this year on April 24th. And this year, it's a total different experience, really, like everything else for us, right? Ramadan is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and therefore a very special month for the Muslim all over the world. And it is a time of inner reflection and devotion to God, while refraining from water and food from like sunrise to sunset. It's getting close. And perception intensifies towards to do more good for yourself, others, and the environment. And that's a very important aspect too during Ramadan. Fasting, honestly, like really teaches us respect and compassion for God's creation, the earth. And it just kind of takes a moment for us to pause and think. And really during this holy month, even more value is put on food and any drop of water, because we're not able to eat all day long, right? So no waste, please. It's kind of emphasized early on for the children too. So when we break our fast, what's called iftar, we try to have normally many, many people together and gather together and enjoy the time together. And we as Zakat Foundation, we emphasize during this time, really, how can we manage and introduce the environmental thoughts into this? And the key point is reducing the trash, for example, as much as possible, and really kind of following the motto, be reuse, reduce, and recycle. We have implemented last year kind of having everyone bring their own bottles in of water, recycling, using recycled plates and cutleries, and everything kind of implementing in that process. Furthermore, I have to tell Muslims to use the time during this Ramadan to reflect on the material possession. What do we really need, and how does it affect really our world all over? So I think absolutely now is the perfect time to encourage each other to be the best steward to God's gift, which is the earth, regardless of race. So be peace upon you. And we're getting close to break the iftar, break fast, finally can eat.
Well, have a good one. And thank
Thank
you so much for sharing that, because what you said really fits so beautifully into the theme of our program tonight. Thank you. And on behalf of ICCT, Orange Chatham, and Campaign Nonviolence, I want to thank all of our speakers. Dirk, thank you so much. We're going to put up the resources again. We've already sent out those resources you were talking about that addresses it in more detail, some of the questions that we've had. And our three panelists, y'all really inspired me, all four of you. And Charles, thanks for your work. I want to especially thank the audience for joining our program tonight. I'm excited that we were able to meet the test of the Zoom and the Facebook challenge here. And we look forward to doing another program like this in the future. We're sending every one of you in the audience warm wishes for safety, for health, and for the energy to multitask as we work to transform our world for the well-being of people and planet. Let the voices of the faithful be heard on behalf of Mother Earth and all beings. Amen and good night.